everybody hear me? If you can't, go get your ears checked, because the speakers are great. All right, so everybody's here to listen to me talk about how I automate my development environment. But first, I kind of have an update on a presentation I gave a while ago. If you remember, I don't know, it was probably 18 months, 2 years ago, I talked about WebAssembly. And there was just some updates from Microsoft on some of their toolings, and so I figured maybe I'll just take a minute or two and share that. But basically, so a little bit of history. Mozilla had been one of the organizations really pushing WebAssembly forward. And back in 2020, they had a round of layoffs, and a lot of that team left. And so, from my point of view, the WebAssembly development out of there kind of stagnated a little bit, even as it was driving forward in other areas. And there was some stuff that was just starting to get off the ground, and it was really taking WebAssembly out of the browser and moving it to the server. So instead of using something like Docker as a container to host your application, the idea is you could build it out to WebAssembly, and WebAssembly would be the system that runs it on your server for you. Benefit is much less overhead, and so, but that kind of, it was moving forward, but it wasn't moving as forward fast as it was when Mozilla was kind of driving it. But then here in December 4th, this article was published. And they kind of talk about several of those specifications that were kind of important. WASI, WebAssembly System Interface, and that's kind of the mechanism that WebAssembly can talk to drives, can talk to storage, can talk to network. WASI is the interface that does that. WebAssembly interface types. We kind of take it for granted in .NET that you can have an assembly with a bunch of code in it, and you can reference that from another application. That's not so easy to do in WebAssembly, but the interface types is part of that. WebAssembly component model is another part of that. And so in a lot of ways, I kind of think that Microsoft, maybe it looks like Microsoft is picking up the gauntlet that was set down by Mozilla and running forward with a lot of that stuff, which is really exciting for a .NET space. There was a presentation that was, I'm not going to play it here, that Mark Rusinovich gave. He is Microsoft's Azure CTO, really smart guy. Spends a lot of time on the cutting edge. He gave a presentation of something his office has been working in their innovation department around this idea and using WebAssembly on the server. And it's a pretty interesting demo. It's just I think it's a 4-minute video. If you're interested in this stuff, this video, him talking about it is worth watching. So just thought I'd throw that out there, share that with the group.
Are there any frameworks that you try to use that?
There's a handful of things. So there's a tool called WASM time, and that's a runtime that you can put on the server, and then you can build your application in it. I wouldn't say there's anything like a framework. The demo that Mark gives in there is a framework, but they haven't actually released it yet that I know of. Yeah. And I guess there's several, we all kind of know there's several web frameworks. There's Blazor for running it on the browser, and then Rust has several, so yeah. But yeah, I would expect things to accelerate in there with Microsoft. And Microsoft kind of has another stake in there. In a future with WebAssembly, the promise is much lower memory overhead, much more efficient CPU memory utilization, which means if you're operating data centers full of computers, you get much more out of those computers. So yeah, interesting stuff. All right. So I didn't build out a fancy slide deck. Matt walked over to my desk probably about 10 days ago and said, we don't have a speaker, do you want to talk about anything? And I said, well, I've done this I've been playing around a lot over the last, 6 months with this process that I've been using to automate my development environment. And I said, I've talked about that to several groups within Kiwit and kind of demoed it there. Let's go ahead and demo it here. So it's not going to be the most polished presentation, but something I played around with quite a bit and maybe I like to talk intelligently about it, but I'm sure if you wanted to, you could stump me with a question or two. Let's talk about the problem, kind of why I started doing this. I've kind of been playing with a lot of different development tools is kind of the first piece. You can kind of see most of my work in these days is actually most of my work isn't in development, but when I do get time to develop, most of that time is spent in JavaScript and TypeScript, React and Node.js, and there's a whole tool chain that you have to set up for that. It's not terribly hard to set up. You can just go out and double click it and download it and install it, but there's still setup that you have to do. The next after TypeScript and Node, .NET is up there, and really similar. It's not terribly hard to install, but you still have to go out, download it, install it. Rust is another programming language. I haven't done a lot with it. Most of my interest in it was actually in that WebAssembly. It kind of was the premier language for WebAssembly for a while. Who knows, maybe .NET is going to pull ahead and I'll be able to do more and more of that Rust, or more and more of that WebAssembly stuff in Rust. But there's a framework and tooling to set up for that. Python. Again, more tooling, more runtimes you have to set up. The way their package management works with their virtual environments, I still don't understand. I don't know what they were thinking when they came up with that, but more tooling. And then Kubernetes, Terraform, Ansible, Azure CLI, Dapper. There's a lot of tools that we use, and setting all of these up, especially if you get a brand new computer, takes quite a bit of time and effort to set all of these up. At work, I know a lot of folks are in kind of environments at work where maybe they don't have full admin access to their work laptop, which has always been a painful thing to deal with at work. We have one of the tools that we constantly have to deal with is a little HTTPS interceptor that our security organization runs, so that all traffic goes through that. And the downside is it's not on it. It basically re-encodes it into a private certificate. So unless you do extra work, the tools don't trust that certificate. So where that impacts, I know I run into it all the time with Node. If you do an npm install and you don't have their right certificate installed, the npm install will basically bomb and say, we got a response that doesn't check out. It doesn't meet the rules of what an HTTPS response should have. And so Python has special stuff you have to set up for that. TypeScript, Node has special stuff you have to set up to deal with that. Rust has some special stuff you have to deal with that. .NET's the one that I've had the least amount of problems with. I don't know, it just seems to work nicely. Yeah. So yeah, challenging setting up those. Consistent environments. I tend to do bouncing back and forth between working over lunch and on a work PC, and then I'll be at home in the evening, pull down the same thing and want to play with it a little bit in the evening, and environments are changed. The version of Node is different or something like that. And so kind of dealing with all of these was kind of what led me. To tell you the truth, if anybody's had to deal with that HTTP interception piece of it, that's the one that motivated me the most. It's a pain to deal with. I see a few people in the audience who have to deal with it, and you can tell by the look of disgust on their face. Fortunately, the automations that we'll look at here kind of clean up all of that. And then we'll kind of talk about a little bit of the alternatives that I looked at, the main one being dev containers, and then kind of the piece that I leveraged to tie all this together is actually VS Code, not Visual Studio, but we'll kind of wrap up with a quick look at a new plugin that Microsoft is developing for VS Code that makes it a little better to work in for .NET applications. So kind of closes the gap that VS Code had for that .NET workload. So basically, the process that I built, it's all built on top of WSL, Windows Services for Linux. Anybody here played with WSL at all? Okay, a couple of folks. Basically, what it does is Microsoft, if you're using WSL version 2, they have gone and created a translation layer, so it's not really running in a VM. They have a translation layer that translates those Linux commands to Windows API calls. And they've done a pretty good job of it, where you basically get Linux running inside your Windows operating system. We can take a look at that. If I open up Windows Terminal, I guess Windows Terminal is another tool that's kind of part of this. If you haven't checked it out, it's a nice little terminal tool. But here I have a Windows, or a WSL instance running in here, and this is actually one that's got my full development environment configured in here. But just to kind of prove out, you know, it's Linux, not Windows, running in here. I run the top command, I get a Windows or a Linux top command there, running under user root. Not something you see in Windows, but it's kind of a little sandbox with that entire Linux system in there. And again, it's not virtualized. You know, I wasn't spinning up a virtual machine with that. It's just kind of all a translation layer. And I am going to, actually let me, I have it open here. All right. So setting up that, basically what I have done inside that WSL tool is I've gone and set up all of these different tools that I use. And I'll, so I can go .NET, and we see .NET in here. I think I can even go --list SDKs, and we'll see the .NET 8 that was just released a couple of weeks ago. We'll take a look at it when we get to actually looking at the automations, but I actually updated this from 7 to 8 during the .NET Conf. So I was kind of refreshing the page, waiting for them to put the right information out there with the updated version. And as soon as they did, made one little change, reran the script, and I was on .NET 8.
That you installed 7, right? 6, 5.
Well, I didn't uninstall 7. What I did is I basically reinstalled the entire computer.
Right.
And so yeah, eventually, if you've had a computer long enough, it collects junk. You download, you try and install this little tool, you use it 1 or 2 times, and you don't use it anymore, you forget it's there. It's probably not hurting anything, but who knows? It may be eating up CPU resources if it's running in the background. May put a library out there that messes with something else. With a mechanism like this, basically I come into work every Monday morning, run the command that we'll look at here, and it paves this entire environment, rebuilds it from scratch. So every Monday morning is like my first day at work. In a good way, yes. So yeah, let's kind of look at the script and what I built out there. First off, go to GitHub. I'll kind of show you where I have this. MFA. I should have logged in before. All right. So I got a bunch of, if you go out to my GitHub page, I have a bunch of junk out there. But this particular project that we'll look at today, it's all out on GitHub. It's called WSL Setup. We'll kind of walk through what it does. No guarantees or anything. If you want to, it's out there public. You can pull it down, fork it, play with it, whatever. If it melts down your entire computer, it's not my fault. I'm telling you. You're responsible if you decide to run it. It's definitely not fully hardened or anything like that. It's good enough for my uses. And I throw it out here because it might be useful for somebody else. So, but yeah, B.E. Olson WSL-setup is what we'll look at. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out to, so I can't run this automation to rebuild my Linux system inside my Linux system. So I have to kind of start out in Windows in PowerShell, and we will see. Maybe we will see. There it is. So I keep one environment setting out here in my Windows setup, and or one repository out here, and that is the WSL setup, so that I can just run it, repave my entire environment. Let's go ahead and look at what it does in here. All right, so kind of the core that is doing a lot of the heavy lifting is a tool called Ansible. Anybody ever heard of Ansible? Okay, it's really, really popular in the system administration landscape. If you have like 500 Linux servers that you need to manage, you're probably going to be using Ansible in order to manage that. In this case, I'm just using it to automate a single machine. But we'll just kind of start from the very tip top, and we'll look at a couple of PowerShell scripts first. First, before we even get into that automation, there is still some basic stuff that I need on the Windows machine. So the idea is when I get that brand new Windows machine, and I get that nice satisfying peel the plastic off the top and that sort of stuff, I can basically clone down this repository and run this one script, and it will install all the dependencies that I use that actually live in that Windows environment. So it's using a tool called WinGit. It probably first showed up probably about 5 years ago. I had never used it before this, but it's a pretty simple tool where people can put packages, publish packages, WinGit packages out there, and then this will download that package manifest and run the installation scripts for you. There's several things in here I probably don't need, like I don't need the Azure Data Studio. I do need Docker Desktop. That is a part of what we'll look at. Visual Studio Code. I still have a local install of Visual Studio Code in there. I don't really need the Git in the Windows environment. I can use the Git in the Linux environment. We'll look at that. Google Chrome. Sorry, Microsoft. One day you might figure out the browser thing. I don't know. Till then, still Google Chrome. Notepad. Everybody should have Notepad. If you don't, throw it on there. Windows Terminal. We kind of looked at Windows Terminal a little bit. Azure Storage Explorer is probably another one I can drop off of here. But running this script installs all those kind of core dependencies that I need. The one thing that's missing in this script, and I noticed it earlier today that I probably should put in here, is actually installing WSL itself. So I still have to go in and manually type. There's just a one-line command in PowerShell that you can type that actually installs WSL. Once WSL is installed, everything else should work. So then computer's already established. I come in Monday morning, sit down, I first thing I will do is I will come in and I will run this script right here. Just a little PowerShell script. It's not doing a whole lot. Basically, all it's doing is it is unregistering or deleting. Unregister is the term for deleting my old WSL environment that I had set up from last week, and it's installing the same thing but empty. So when this runs, it doesn't take too terribly long to run. When this runs, I will have a empty, nothing in it WSL instance. I mean, I guess there's stuff in there. It's the standard Linux stuff that you get when you install Ubuntu, but none of my development stuff in there. Then the next thing that I will do is I will come out and run setup dist. Now, this is just again, it's another fairly small script. All that it's really doing is it is going to use this WSL command that you see on line 9 to run a command inside that Linux environment. So this is, instead of me opening up that WSL environment and typing the command in there manually, this is a way using the Windows command line tool, WSL, to run a command in that environment. So it's just WSL, what type of shell. The distribution is actually the name of the machine that I'm running it in, the username I want to run it as. And then this first command, it's the very first command there, or the one on line 9, is really doing nothing but converting Windows line endings to Linux line endings. So I have that bootstrap.shell program, just convert the line endings from Windows to Linux. Otherwise, it won't run over in that other Linux environment. And then the next command that it does, once it's converted those line endings, it will run this bootstrap.sh program. The bootstrap.sh program does all the heavy lifting. It takes about 20 minutes to run. So at this point, once I've started this, I fill out my timesheet for the last week. So have to do that before 10 o'clock. Otherwise, we get nasty emails that we didn't fill it out. So I fill it out while the rest of this is running. Let's look at that bootstrap. Now, the bootstrap, again, remember, because I was running it with that WSL command, it's going to be running inside that Linux environment, that WSL Linux environment. So at this point, the script has made the switch from Windows to now running inside of Linux. And it's not doing too terribly much. It's just kind of setting the stage in order to actually run the actual automations. So we just do a apt update and an apt upgrade just to update all the packages on that installation to the latest and greatest versions. And then we install Ansible, and I kind of suspect I don't need the line on line 5 anymore. But we install Ansible, and then we run Ansible to run the playback. Ansible is actually the tool that powers it is Python. So running that apt install Ansible should pull down all the Python stuff that it needs, which unfortunately is quite a bit. But yeah. Just takes a couple of command lines there, and then it'll run the Ansible playbook. The Ansible playbook is where the heart of the automations is. Typically, if you were like a systems administrator, you'd be running this command on a local machine, and then it would remotely connect to, your 500 other machines in your data center. In this case, I'm just connecting to my local machine. All right, so let's look at the playbook. And can everybody see the screen? Is it good enough?
Question for you, Brian. I might have missed something. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How did the playbook YAML file get into the container?
It didn't. So when I run that command, even though it's running inside that Linux instance, if you look at the path that it's running from, it is running from a /mnt/c. So your WSL instance will mount your Windows drive to it. And we can...
Oh, yeah, let's go back.
So here is, if I go pwd, I'm at /home/B Olson, my home directory. If I go cd/mntc and go list there, we're going to see some weird permission denied errors because as it's trying to access those things, those kind of unique Windows things in the Linux environment, it doesn't quite know how, but you'll kind of see the, let me go, ls. You can kind of see when I'm in that /mnt/c, I'm on my Windows file system. There is a program files, there's documents and settings. These aren't Linux things. This is my Windows environment. If I continue users, B. Olson, should be a source. This is basically the same directory that I have open over in the VSCode window that we're looking at there. So it's not actually moving this files over there, it's just running it from that location.
Can you, real quick, can you show that script, the PowerShell script again?
Yes. PowerShell. So I don't have to do anything. Basically, it's going to take this WSL -- shell. I think it probably has a default setting on that shell. Which distribution you want to run it into, who I want to run it as. I want to run it as my Linux username inside that Linux system. And then the command I want to run, that exec. And then WSL will handle running that command I typed in Windows inside that Linux instance.
Directory that this
yes.
is running.
Yep.
That's really cool.
Yeah. There's other things that's kind of interesting that WSL kind of blurs the lines between Windows and Linux. Like I can, if I go into, so here I'm in Linux, I typed notepad.exe, that shouldn't work inside Linux, but it does. So they do some weird voodoo stuff. But yeah.
So that means the Windows path applies to Linux.
Well, Notepad. Oh, I know why. Maybe. There it goes. Because the Notepad instance was still running. All right. All right, so we looked at the shell script, so it's just ran that, and it's running the actual playbook. So this again is where we kind of really get into the heart of what it's doing. We'll dig into some of these tasks that I've created, and we'll kind of look at them in a little bit closer detail. But basically, if I was running this against like 500 machines, I'd have what is called a host. That's not host file. Maybe it is host file. There's a file that you have in Ansible that will have the host names of every system that you want to run this against, and it has a way that you can group it into groups so that you can say, I want to run this Ansible command against my web servers. I want to run this Ansible command against my database servers. I don't really need any of that. I'm just running it on localhost, so I can just kind of hard code, just run it on my local machine. It's that kind of that first line. And then the tasks. It's going to go down these tasks in order. So it's going to start at the very top. The very first one, configure Windows certificates. This is the one that helps me deal with that painful problem of that HTTPS interceptor sitting in between there. So basically what this will do, this will be one that we'll open up and look a little bit closer at. We're basically importing the role dev Windows certs. If I go into my roles folder, which is an Ansible convention, if I go into my roles folder, there will be a dev Windows certs. And when you create one of these roles, there's a little Ansible script that will create out a whole folder structure for it, including like this defaults, handlers, meta, tasks, tests. It creates out this whole folder structure. Out of everything in here, I'm only like using 1 or 2 files in here, so most of these I haven't leveraged yet. Like tests, there's a mechanism for testing all of this stuff in Ansible. I don't have anything in there. I haven't played with that, but if we go to tasks and look at the main, and each of these items are a step that it goes through in setting up this certificates file, or my certificates. So the first thing that it will do is I have to create the directory that I want to put my special cert in. Kind of aside, the way with the HTTP interception utility, the way that I manage it in here prior to running this, I will browse out to one of our sites that's going through that and click here, certificate is valid, and export. I need to find the right one. I don't have it on here, but yeah. And I just export. So this is my personal PC, so it doesn't have that HTTP interception on it, but if it did, you would see the name of the company that we use for that. It's their signed certificate. I select it, I hit export, and I save that file that it gives me in this certs folder. So I just dump the file there, dump the cert there, run this script. This will basically, if that file is there, and see, I'm kind of, again, I'm running, even though the files are located in my Windows environment and I'm running this from a Linux environment, I still have that .certs file relative to where I'm at, because again, this is running in the Windows file system even though it's running in Linux. But yeah, I create the directory, WinCerts directory. I copy everything from this certs folder into this user local share CA certificates WinCerts. The CA certificates, again, is a Linux convention. You put your certs here, and then when we run one of these next commands, it will bundle that into the system-wide bundle. So I dump that file there, and then I run this update CA certs, and that actually does that work of taking that certificate, that HTTPS injected certificate, bundling it up in my systems, in my WSL system certs, and putting it there. So that right there fixes a lot of the Linux tools that we're going to look at. So now I kind of have the certificate issue solved. And we're not going to look at every single task in here. A lot of them are kind of repetitive, but I go through, set up Git. With Git, we'll kind of look at it. There is actually a tool called Git Credentials Manager. Interesting, it was originally built in .NET, and so it was kind of an initiative that came out of a few folks at Microsoft. They built a little tool to help with the Git Credentials Manager, and it just helps you authenticate without having to, makes the authentication into Git easier, Git servers easier, whether it's Azure DevOps or GitHub. So I run through that. I set up a tool called Oh My Bash. If you worked on, maybe you've seen in Windows environments, someone might have these little fancy thingamaboppers on their command line. Windows, there's a tool called Oh My Posh. In Linux, there's a tool called Oh My Bash. and it's just a mechanism that you can put these custom themes in here that bring in extra stuff into your command line. So from here I can actually see, I can see I'm on the main branch of this particular project. Because of the color, I can tell that I've changed a file in there. So just things like that. It'll also, kind of the red X shows that the last line was an air condition, and so just gives me a little bit of information. But yeah, that's Oh My Bash. WSL utilities, that's probably one that I can drop. Setting up Python, setting up Node.js. I'm going to jump into Node.js because it's a little bit interesting. Node.js. So for Node.js, there's first off there's a Linux package. If you worked in Ubuntu, typically the way you would install packages is apt, and this is just a way for working with that Ubuntu apt package manager. So I'm installing libsecret-1-dev, and then here Ansible built-in stat. All that I'm doing here is I'm saying, is there an nvm.sh file? Does that file exist? If, and this step here doesn't do anything other than just say, does it exist or not? And it registers it as a variable. So if nvm.sh stat exists, this will have a true value into it. It actually stat.exist.true. And then in the very next step, I check that. So the when, basically I'm saying if it doesn't exist, install it. Because like if I run this twice, I don't want to install it twice. I just want to skip over it if it's already there. So so if it doesn't exist, install it. Basically, this is installing NVM. So there's a little, if you go out to the NVM website, they're one of those that basically the install, instead of delivering a package or something that you can install doing package utility, they give you a shell script and they say run this script, and they'll download all the right tools and install it. So I download that and basically save the contents of that script in a variable. I'm not doing something I should be doing here. I really should be checking the hash of that script. So if it changes, like maybe a bad actor gets in there and puts something bad in there, I at least want to know that the file changed. You can actually put a hash in here where it would error out if that file changed. So then it runs the NVM install script, just using bash. That should install NVM. And NVM is basically it stands for Node Version Manager. It's a mechanism where you can run NVM commands to install different versions of Node. So you can have 5 or 6 different versions of Node on yours and switch between them with this NVM command. And all that I'm doing is I use that NVM to install Node. So it's just running this shell command, running that nvm.sh, and then nvm install in the version of Node that I want. And then because Node works a little bit different, Node by default won't pay attention to those system certificates, which I just fixed up the system certificates in an earlier step. Node doesn't pay attention to those by default, so I have to do a little bit extra work to get Node. This is npm. This is the package manager, but doing a little bit extra. This is Node, this first one. Doing a little bit of extra work just to tell Node, hey, don't use your internal certificates, go look at the certificates that I just set up. And then same thing with NVM. So at that point I have a fully working Node environment. If I go back to...
So that, if you go back to where you're setting up a certificate, is it just you're setting up the environment variable that's Node's actual check-in? So it's going to be used by every Node version, or you need to do that for every?
You're talking,
Well, where you're setting up certificates for the node.
Oh,
It was
okay.
the second from the bottom.
okay,
The export there.
yeah, so setting up the certificates, you have to set an environment variable, node extra certs CL, but I'm not running that directly. Instead, I am dumping that in my .profile. And so when I log in next time, everything that's in your .profile will run on login. And so that will set up, every time I log into this system, that'll set up that environment variable pointing to the right location. And Ansible actually has they have a couple of mechanisms for working with text files, because a lot of times your automation might control part of that text file, but not the entire text file. So this little block in file, you can actually put a marker, and it will use that to denote in that profile, and we can look at it. Actually, let me, since we have it set up here, cat tilde/profile. We can see this line right here. It wrapped it with that begin Ansible manage block, end Ansible manage block, and it's smart enough to be able to say, if I were to go in and tell it, there's another parameter that I could put in here that says exist. If I put exist in there and said no, it would delete that out of my profile. Yeah, and then the npm config, it works a little bit different. It doesn't use an environment variable. You run this npm config command and it'll set up its own text file in its own location, so I don't have to put that in my profile.
So if npm is going to install a different version of npm, do I need to run this command again?
So like if I'm working, like I run this Monday, it installs one version of Node, and I want to, Wednesday I want to run a different version of Node. Because it's installed that NVM tool, I could come in here and just go NVM npm install, and I'll just do the latest LTS. So if I run this command, what it's going to do is this is automatically going to go out. Sorry, not install. NVM install LTS. NVM is just a little tool that helps you manage your node instances. .NET, the .NET CLI does a similar thing. You can use the .NET CLI to download instances of the SDK, and this does similar thing.
I guess in my example, so let's say I have a project with my TypeScript and all that, and it's using, let's say, Node 18.
Yep.
But somebody just upgraded to Node 20. I pulled my latest for this repository, and now I need to install a new node. I'm going to run npm install in this repo, but do I then need to run those commands for the certificate?
If you can get everybody on your team using NVM, there is actually, what you can do in the root of your repository is just put a .nvm file in there with the version of Node in it, and as soon as you change directory into there, it will say, oh, you're on NVM, or this project is using Node 18. So it will install, or it'll switch over to Node 18. I don't think it'll install it, but it'll switch over to it. So you might still have to go install it, but...
Your question is, will that certificate, the environment variable?
Oh, the certificate. The certificate. Yeah. That certificate's global across all versions of Node. So yeah, if you switch from one version, I'm sorry, I wasn't quite catching it.
Yeah, we will.
Yep.
I'm very familiar with NVM.
Okay. Yeah. That certificate, as long as that environment variable set, every version of Node that I've come across will work with it. So as long as that environment variable set. Yeah. There's a handful of tools. NVM's kind of the old school one. It was the first, I think.
I switched to Volt because it works with Windows.
Yeah, and I think Volt.
If I'm on my Mac.
Yeah, and I think Volt also manages the package manager too.
Yeah, so you don't have to have an individual one for each version.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Let's continue walking down through the installing Azure CLI, Dapper CLI, Wireshark. So I'll call out Wireshark and dbeaver. So these are kind of interesting. So I'm running in a Linux environment. I've been working with it in the terminal, but Wireshark and dbeaver. So Wireshark is a tool that you can look at network packets with. There's a Telerik tool. What's the Telerik tool called? Fiddler. So yeah, if you've used Fiddler to kind of look at the network traffic, Wireshark is kind of similar. I think Wireshark is more a power user-ish, harder to use, but and then dbeaver is a database, kind of like SQL Management Studio. It's kind of a tool you can connect to, fiddle with your databases, that sort of stuff. But they're both GUI tools. They both have UIs, and I'm installing these in my Linux system. How do I get those GUIs to come up? Well, one of the things that I think is pretty slick that they've got in WSL is it can, from within that Linux instance, it can run a GUI application. So my favorite demo of this is Xeyes, and if you're, wow, it is wonking out. It did not do that. Okay, all right. So it's not letting me move the mouse, otherwise it goes crazy, but Xeyes is an old, I think that was on the very first Linux system I set up back in last century. But here we have Windows displaying a Linux GUI application in here, and if my mouse wouldn't go crazy on me, you would actually see the eyes, so you can kind of see the eyes are following the cursor around, so there's like interactivity between there. And I can pop open that Wireshark tool, sudo Wireshark. And there it goes.
That's the HDMI.
That could be it. But yeah, it doesn't quite feel like a Windows interface, and it's not quite as snappy as a native Windows interface. But it's useful to be able to have those shifted over to my dev instance there, where I can automate their setup and working with them. It must be the HDMI. It was working fine when I ran through this at lunch. And then installing Kubernetes. Another one, the last one on here, the VSCode extensions. That one, it runs, it completes, it looks like it works, but it doesn't actually install the extensions. The idea with that is basically I'm working in VSCode, building all this stuff inside of VSCode, and I have my extensions that I want in there, like my linting tools and testing tools and all that sort of stuff is all set up in there. I want to be able to keep on working with it after I paid my system. So the idea was to be able to have this automatically install those extensions. For some reason it's not. I haven't figured out why. So yeah, I have to remember every Monday morning after I run this script, I'm like frustrated for the first hour because where'd my lint tool go? Why isn't it showing lint errors? So I have to go back and manually install that. So anyways, this sets up the automations. I had a So we talked a little bit, this is a .NET development user group. VSCode, I've really enjoyed working in VSCode, but it's not great for .NET stuff, or it hasn't been great for .NET stuff. Microsoft recently released an extension that gets it a lot better, and I don't think I actually installed it. So it's this C# dev kit. Unfortunately, kind of parts of this are not open source. Parts of it are open source, and it kind of collects several different plugins. Some of them are community ones, but basically, I'll go ahead and install this, and hopefully, it doesn't take too long to install. And we'll kind of walk through how I might work with a .NET solution really quick in this sort of environment.
Brian, this instance of Visual Studio Code is running in your WSL.
This instance is running in Windows.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, and every time that I'm running in WSL, I'm running a Windows instance of VS Code. I'm running a Windows instance of VS Code, and then I connect to a remote server. So WSL will host a VS Code remote server, and that's how it bridges from my desktop VS Code to working in that Linux environment.
So all the tooling and everything that you just installed is available here.
Yeah.
If you drop the terminal, it would be the terminal for your WSL.
No, I'm not connected to that remote one right now.
Okay.
So, but as soon as I do connect to there, I'd show you, but I want to let this thing install. And this is one I probably should have installed earlier because it does take a while to pull down. Yeah.
Normal Visual Studio?
They don't have, so the ability to connect to remote systems and develop isn't in normal Visual Studio yet. I haven't heard anything from Microsoft saying it's going to be there, but I'm hopeful that it will, because this is I like working this way. They did, about a year ago, they did announce that they were supporting Visual Studio connecting to remote instances for Linux, for C++ workloads. So not .NET, unfortunately, but if you're working on a C++ instance, apparently you can connect Visual Studio to a remote system.
Debugging.
Yeah, it'll do debugging and all of that sort of stuff. The remote, I think the remote development capabilities of Visual Studio is kind of slick. I'm using it to connect to my remote WSL instance, even though it's on my same machine. But there's no reason why that remote instance couldn't be a super powerful server in my basement at home, and I just remotely connect to that. It would work very similar to what I'm doing here, which is kind of, I think it's kind of nice, because then it means you can get a lot cheaper laptop. You can focus on the things that we really like in laptops: a good display, good keyboard, save all the expensive power for the great big desktop machine. That's a lot cheaper to get that powerful system, and leave that remote and take your laptop wherever you want to work. Connect to the big powerful machine. All right, so finally installed. I'm going to exit out of here. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new directory, and I'm in that Linux environment. So unfortunately, I guess I'll kind of step back. The automation script unfortunately takes about 20 minutes to set up the entire system. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to run it here, and I don't know what type of network I have. So I'd be pulling down a whole bunch of packages and stuff to install that. So I'm not going to run it here live. I thought about starting it while I was kind of talking through it and just letting it run in the background, but I didn't want it to get halfway through and blow up because of bandwidth issues or something like that. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to demo that part of it, but we can So this is one that I ran. This environment I built out over lunch, so there's not a lot in it. If I go .NET new SLN, basically this will create a solution file. So we're all .NET developers here. We're all familiar with what a solution file is. I go cat test solution, just an empty .NET solution file. And I am going to go code dot. And I'm running this command inside that WSL instance. Basically what it'll do is it knows I'm remotely connected to this machine since it's my WSL instance. It is going to start up, you might see it along the bottom when I hit enter. It's going to start up a VSCode server and then launch that VS Code, launch my Windows VS Code and connect it to there. I'm going to hit enter. And yep, updating VS Code server version, installing. So apparently I was behind a version or two. So it's updating it to the latest. Updates that VS Code server, launches this, connects to there. Yep, I trust it. If we look down in the bottom left hand, where there's that little blue knob, or that little blue section there, it says WSL Ubuntu, that is indicating the remote system that I'm connected to. So I know it's a little bit weird because I keep on saying I'm connected to a remote system, even though it's this system, but it's that remote WSL instance. So I'm connected to there. Now, I might have make sure it installed it. Let me try opening it. Code dot slash. Try opening it this way. No. Code. Yes. All right.
I think it's just code.
Yeah. The extension that I'm looking for isn't firing. Oh. Okay. Oh. Okay. I know what's wrong. So when I was bouncing around, changing directories and stuff, I'm not in that Linux directory, I'm in that Windows directory, and I think that might have been causing some of the issues. But go back to my Linux directory. All right. MKD, dir, test. Create that new solution. Yes. All right. I am not seeing what I was expecting to see. It should. It's installed in this instance. It's enabled. Yeah, it should work. solution. There we go. Okay. All right. So open solution was what I missed. So what it's going to do here is it's going to, okay, it did it. It did what I was looking for. Does anybody notice? Nope. All right. I'll point it out. So one of the pain points in working with solutions in .NET code or in VSCode is you typically just have a plain old file explorer, and it just shows here's a directory, here's the directory contents. It doesn't have that additional intelligence that you get in the Solution Explorer in a Visual Studio. But they have added Solution Explorer down here. I'm just going to reorder this to put the Solution Explorer on the top, and here I have my test solution. I can right click, new project. Let's create a web API project. Enter default directory. I didn't give it a different name, but I created a web application project. If I go new project, and we're going to create a class library. So I'll just default class library. So I have, instead of just a folder full of stuff, I have intelligence that I'm working in a .NET solution here. How about typically you create a class library, you want to add a reference to that class library from your web application. Prior to this tool, you had to go find the project file and update the path yourself. Not fun. But here I can just go and add project reference. Here's the list of projects is in this solution. Click there. If I expand it, I'm going to see dependencies. I don't know. Oh, it's still updating stuff in the background. But packages, I added a project reference. So we can see in my web application there, I now have a reference to my class library that I added there. And this, if you're used to working in Visual Studio, and the full Visual Studio, this is like trivial. That's like, it's like, why is that a big deal? We do this all the time. But this wasn't, until this toolkit came out, this wasn't very easy in the VS Code environment. Now it's still, I think you still have a much better view of like your test reporter and stuff like that. There is a test reporter in here, but I think the one built in Visual Studio is a lot nicer. What time is it? Did I talk too long? But then we also get if I go, I'll show this, if I go start debugging, I don't want to debug plain text, web application, build, rebuild, debug, start a new instance. It's gonna automatically start up a new instance, attach a debugger to it, and I have my ASP.NET web application working almost as easy it would be in full-blown Visual Studio. So.
Do you have a NuGet package manager?
That's a good question. Packages. I'm right-clicking, it's not doing anything. Yeah, there might be. Open solution, new project. Yeah, there might be a way to add packages. I don't know. I'm old school, just write it all.
Do a CLI.
Yeah. I'm surprised that wasn't maybe.
Package manager is actually a pretty sophisticated tool. So I'm surprised.
You could still drop out to command line, and I think you can install it from the .NET tool. All right. So yeah. So I think that, I didn't talk too much about dev containers. Dev containers, it's another Microsoft initiative. I guess I'll just kind of sum it up. I played with dev containers quite a bit, spent several hours messing around with it. I could never find a flow with dev containers that I was really happy with working. The promise of them is awesome, being able to have your entire development environment embedded in a Docker container that you then check in with that source code. So, this is great, but if I change this 5 years from now, the thing I was working on today might not work 5 years from now because I've changed my environment. Where dev containers, the promise is you check that dev container right in next to your source code, and then 5 years from now you just pull down that same dev container and work in there. I couldn't get into a natural flow with dev containers, but maybe I just need to go back and try it. I'd be curious if anybody has checked out dev containers a little bit. What'd you think of it?
I didn't have a whole lot of time to play around with it, but yeah, the concept is nice.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I think, any questions, thoughts? Yes?
Since you're running on a single WSL instance, what's the difference, or what's the reason for using Ansible versus just a shell script?
Good question. I could have wrote this all in a shell script. I think part of my initial motivation is I know where I work, our infrastructure folks use Ansible a lot, and they've been talking about using it to automate development environments, so I kind of wanted to learn about it a little bit more. Yeah.
Benefit that you get out of it?
There probably is some versus just a shell script, because in areas where I've taken care with writing the Ansible tasks, I can run them as many times as I want without breaking something. So if it fails halfway through, I can just say, rerun the entire thing, or I can even just say, hey, just run the ones with this tag on it, and it kind of handles all of that. So stuff you could do with shell scripts, but
well, I think the file thing that you're doing with adding the exports in there is great.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
Well, it'd be more work. Yeah. So, and the other thing, so I'm not an Ansible expert, but my understanding is, I'll go out to that Git repo. So my understanding is, because I have all of my Ansible, they're called roles, in this role directory in the root of my project, because it's located there in that folder, I should be able to, and because it's in GitHub, I should be able to reference it from another Ansible script. So I should be able to go to an Ansible script, point it to this GitHub repository, and run this outside of my dev management stuff. I haven't actually tried that, but I think it works that way.
Anyway, questions along the same line. So there was a PowerShell script that you're getting where you use it when you get to install some programs, and
Yep.
the Ansible script also install additional ones.
Yep.
Is the PowerShell script you're in the beginning, is that a prerequisite to install some dependencies for the Ansible script to then run? It's like where you're going to
So I don't think that initial PowerShell script, the one that did the WinGit stuff, I will just go, we'll just look at it here. Here's a really cool trick if you haven't seen it. If you go out to any GitHub, this isn't answering your question, I'll get to that. If you go out to any GitHub page, where you get down to where you're seeing this, if you hit the period key, so I'm just going to hit the period key, and it is going to launch a VSCode instance embedded in the browser in that repository. So, and that's just any GitHub page. But yeah, so you're talking about when I ran this setup win, it wasn't setting up any dependencies that were directly used by the Ansible script. It was more so setting up the Windows tools that I use in my development day to day. So there's still a handful of Windows tools, like the Docker desktop, setting up Docker desktop, setting up Visual Studio Code, which is still running in that Windows instance, just setting up those handful of Windows tools that I still use. So, and you could, there is a WinGit, if you still wanted to use the full-blown Visual Studio, there is a WinGit install for Visual Studio. So you can install, other development tools that way too.
So let's say you come in Monday morning, are you purging first what you have?
This script right here, this install dist, it dumps the old environment. And so the catch is, and I should probably see if I can figure out some way to warn me on here. The catch is, like, if Friday I forgot to check in my code and I forgot to push it up, when I run this on Monday, it is gone. So that's further incentive to be sure to push your working code up to your remote server, because when I run that, it is gone. I'm sure you could probably figure out a way to get it back, but
It's always better the second time.
yeah,
Right?
yes, yeah. The first one was just practice. Any other questions? Cool. Well, if you want, like I say, it's not documented very well, but it is out on GitHub if you wanted to look at it, play around with it. Maybe someday I'll spend some more time documenting it and polishing it up, but I mainly put it out there to solve a problem I was having and thought maybe you all would enjoy hearing about it. So,
Take pull requests.
do I take pull requests? You could submit one. I don't know.
If somebody wants to add their own.
I would say if you look at this and you want to grab it, fork it, change it all you want over there to fit your development needs. And if you feel like sending a pull request, I'll look at it. So.
One cool thing I just remembered about dev containers, I think, if you set up a dev container and check it into GitHub, I think there's a way where within GitHub you can run your full environment,
Yep.
file everything in the node.
Yeah, there is. What do they call that? The remote. There's something in Azure has something too. The remote dev things that you can spin up in Azure. I'm looking at you.
You mean the GitHub?
Well, GitHub has it and Azure has it.
What they're called Azure. It's not Dev Labs. I think that's different.
Code spaces.
Code spaces, yes.
That's GitHub, isn't it?
Yeah, but you can basically, it will run Visual
But,
Studio,
yeah.
and then you hit run, and then it will do all the magic.
Yeah.
Give you a...
And it uses that same dev containers that you could then run locally. And so, yeah. But yeah, I'll have to go back at some point and play around with dev containers more, because there's a huge amount of promise there. I couldn't come up with a flow that felt right to me. So, cool. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Do we have